That is passed. Thank you. Right, we will just take oh no, I think we can move straight on at least to questions, and we could probably have a break after questions. We will move on now to Plan Change 120, the scenario for consultation with iwi authorities and engagement with local boards. Oh, they're behind me. And just, I hope you all got my email last night. I know that Councillor Newman and Councillor Winiata have the amendment on to put forward A, but I made sure they both knew that I was putting forward a Chair's recommendation to start off with, but of course it doesn't preclude the amendment as well. So, and it was the Mayor, I think. Mayor Brown, you're still happy to second? Yeah, the Mayor was seconding A and B. So just being clear, the recommendations that are on the table are to put scenarios A and B to iwi authorities and local board. That doesn't preclude, obviously, conversations about other options, but those options will have the detailed maps and map viewers for everyone to understand, to get feedback, and then we'll come back in July. The staff will still present on their recommended option, which is B, and then we can go to questions. Kia ora. John and Phil, thank you.
Right. Kia ora koutou. Good afternoon, members of the committee. So, short presentation. Do have Phil Reid here, our Auckland-wide manager, who will do a little demonstration of the GIS viewer that's developing for engagement with local boards, iwi, and then ultimately the public when your decisions are made in July. So, clicking through. Wow. Apologies.
This happened earlier too. We might just get Sandra will click through it if you just want to do that. I don't know why.
So overview, slide 2, please. That's it. Okay, purpose of the item, we're just going to present a recommended scenario, as the Chair has mentioned, as you would have read in the agenda report, for potential changes to PC 120 for the purpose of engagement with iwi authorities and local boards to then, as I mentioned, bring back to you in July. We're looking at an extraordinary meeting at the end of July to allow sufficient time for iwi and local boards to provide feedback and for our teams to get out there and engage and explain a scenario or scenarios to iwi and local boards. So end of July is when your final decisions will be made at this stage in the process. So just covering 3 main things, a recap of the 4 scenarios that you've heard about in several workshops now. There's a little adjustment to what we're calling scenario B, slightly different to the last workshop, and I'll explain the difference and why we've put that forward. Then we'll talk to that recommended scenario B and talk to the process ahead, which I've already begun. Next slide, please. Okay, so the 4 scenarios. Scenario A is what we've referred to as essentials only. So the government does require, through this process of potential changes to Plan Change 120, to still implement the National Policy Statement Urban Development, which has those core things around the walkable catchments of the city centre, the 11 metropolitan centres, all of the train stations, the busway stations. So all of the scenarios include those bottom line government requirements. The other key government requirement is now that overall capacity for new homes has to be 1.4 million, at least 1.4. Current unitary plan is saying about 1.18, I think from memory, so just under 1.2 million is what the unitary plan already allows for. The new requirement has to take that up to 1.4 million. So if you do the government requirements around the walkable catchments, around some of the town centres, and nothing else, you would achieve roughly 1.4 to to 1.6 million. So you'd hit the 1.4 and it may be as high as 1.6 depending on the final modelling work that will be undertaken. So the summary of that on the screen there is the heights in those walkable catchments in Plan Change 120 would reduce all down to 6 stories. So as you might recall, in Plan Change 120, quite a few walkable catchments allow for 10-storey buildings and in some cases 15. So it would go to the government minimum of 6 stories, although, little asterisk there, there are 5 stations that you've heard a lot about on the Western Line that the government requires 15 stories within the walkable catchment. 2 of those, it's Mongawhau, Kingsland, and then for Morningside, Baldwin Avenue and Mount Albert Station, there's a requirement of 10 stories. So that's the exception there. That's government requirement. And then around some of the town centres, the many town centres, commercial strips in Auckland, commercial main streets, there is a requirement to allow for more intensification than the unitary plan already does. But perhaps for some of those smaller, what we call local centres, a small group of maybe a dozen, 15 or so shops, there are many of those across the region. Plan Change 120 had some intensification allowed around those, 6-storey residential allowed. So you could reduce that back, and we say that that would still meet the government minimum requirements. So that's the what we call essentials only. Next, if you could click through, please. Scenario B, and they've all come up here, but that's absolutely fine. So scenario B takes the overall capacity for homes to about 1.5 million, maybe up to 1.7 million. So quite a bit more there. Just going through those boxes, those walkable catchment heights, they would be reduced in areas beyond 10 kilometres of the city centre from what's already in Plan Change 120, but within that inner 10 kilometres, the heights would stay as they are in Plan Change 120 on all 3 train lines and also, I think, on the North Shore, Takapuna. So we'll go into that scenario B in a little bit more detail shortly. And in terms of those many sort of town and local centres, the scenario B would continue to allow intensification around not just the larger town centres, but also some of those smaller shopping areas. The intensification around those would still be retained as per 120, out to about a 200-metre distance. Those bus corridors that were sitting in Plan Change 120, allowing for 6-storey apartment development along many of the bus corridors. The scenario B removes the outlying bus corridors, but retains that intensification opportunity for more development in the inner part of the region. And then for the what we call the wider residential area, so that's the bulk of residential Auckland, this scenario would keep the unitary plan as it currently stands, as would scenario A. So we have got a slide coming up in a little while that really compares A and B, so you can have a really good feel for what the differences are. If we jump to quite a different scenario, that's scenario C, and that's where the heights in the walkable catchment stay exactly as per Plan Change 120. The heights around the town centres and all of the local centres across the region stay as per 120. The bus corridors would drop away, no intensification outside of the 10Ks, and within the 10Ks, instead of allowing for 6 stories, this scenario talks about allowing for generally 3 stories along those bus corridors within the inner 10Ks. And in that wider residential area, there would be a sort of full reset of the unitary plan, looking to align the residential zones, the different level of density they allow for, based on the access to public transport, shops, amenities, employment, and so on. So we had a tool that did that for Plan Change 120, scenario D. Scenario C would adjust that a little bit. You would see less of the 3-storey mixed housing urban that seemed to cause a lot of concern for some or many submitters. So you would, under scenario C, see less mixed housing urban, 3 stories, but it would be a full reset of that wider suburban residential. So it does have widespread changes across all of the region. And scenario D is keep Plan Change 120 as it is. All of the heights in the walkable catchments as they are, all the intensification around all of the centres as they are, all of the bus corridors inside 10Ks, outside 10Ks as they are, and the wider residential had a lot of 3-storey mixed housing urban to get that capacity up to the 2 million. So that's the scenarios. Next slide, please. So just going to build up scenario B. Sandra, if you wouldn't mind clicking on. So this is the recommended scenario in the report. Apologies, this does require a few clicks, so I'll have to sort of say, click please. If you just pause there. What this does is it first of all shows those walkable catchments. So that's all of the walkable catchments required by the government to allow for at least 6 stories. What scenario B does is for some of those locations, it keeps the plan change 120, 10 and 15 story heights. You can see it in green and blue there. It's generally within the 10 kilometres, starting with Smales Farm and Takapuna in the North Shore. We've got New Lynn, Avondale, and then we've got the mandatory stations in the west coming in from Mount Albert to Baldwin Avenue, then into the green area in the west. I should probably see if the pointer works. So we're now sort of coming in the western line. You'll see that's the mandatory government stations in here. Then around the city centre, there would be generally enabling 15 stories, not just the mandatory 6 stories. And then as you come down the southern and eastern lines, you'll see exactly as Plan Change 120, 15 stories around some of the stations and 10 around stations like Orake, Meadowbank, Sylvia Park, Panmure, I think is 15. So I can certainly take questions on the specific stations. They are listed in the report, but it just gives you a sense of keeping Plan Change 120 as it is, whereas under scenario A, the 10 and the 15 stories would only be on that western line. They wouldn't be around the city centre or the southern eastern lines. If you can click through, please, Sandra. Sorry. One click will bring in the many town and local centres in Plan Change 120, so there will be no change. That's that retain tick there. So you can see them coming through, generally allowing 6-story residential around all of the town centres and all of the smaller local centres across the region. If we can click again, please. The frequent transport corridors, so there's bus corridors that allow for 6-story intensification under Plan Change 120. They would be retained, but only in the inner core. So that's Sandringham Road, Dominion Road, Mount Eden Road, Great South Road, New North Road, Ellerslie Panmure Highway, Remuera St John's Road. I think that's just about covered them all, but you can see them coming through there in Erasmus and a few on the North Shore as well, Oniwa Road, and I think is that Birkenhead, Northcote Road. So no change to Plan Change 120, but we're saying so that's basically retain as per 120 in the inner 10Ks, and then outside of it those bus corridor ideas would fall away in this process. One more click, I think, and we're covered off just about on this slide. And in the wider residential area, what we brought through there is essentially the unitary plan as it stands with all of its different residential and business and other zones. There are some refinements in terms of hazards in that wider residential area that Phil's here to just recap on some of those. Effectively, you're seeing the unitary plan come through for the wider residential area. So percentage-wise, for scenario B, that wider residential is about, get that right, it's about 85% of the region is in that wider residential. So if you can do one more click, you'll see, so 15% would be going through some sort of change as part of PC 120 under scenario B. And the white area would be retain unitary plan as it is. So if we can move on, please. So why at this stage in the process would we recommend scenario B? Well, through the various workshops, we've had a range of views from the committee, and we've really just tried to sort of pull that together into some sort of balanced, coherent approach, building on the range of perspectives we've heard. We've heard support for doing a bit more than A. We've heard support for doing quite a lot more than A. We've also heard the perspective of just keep with the bare minimum. So we've built on B a bit by bringing in those bus corridors that was missing from the previous workshop. We think that if there was a single scenario, it might make it easier for iwi and local boards to respond to it, but it was always our intention, it still would be our intention, to present all 4 scenarios to iwi and local boards as a bit of context to explain where the committee has come from. But rather than us sort of pick and choose which of the 4 scenarios do you think is the best? Local boards or iwi were asking for general feedback around a preferred scenario, but we'd certainly explain the other three in case there's a strong preference for one of the other scenarios. From a city outcomes point of view, I guess B, relative to, say, A, is allowing the 10 and the 15 stories on the other train lines, not just the Western line. There's always been something that just doesn't feel quite right about just enabling 10 and 15 stories on one of the train lines when the other train stations within that inner 10 Ks also benefit from CRL. They also have close, travel distances to city centre. So it gives an equivalent approach, not just the named stations on the Western line. By including allowing for more development on the bus corridors in the inner isthmus, there are clearly some benefits in terms of investment in public transport, not just rail, but also buses, particularly in the inner part of the region. And I guess at a big picture level, it is allowing housing in the areas of greatest demand in the region and in areas more likely to see increase in supply over time. So you heard from our chief economist, Gary Blick, in several workshops about how these scenarios might affect housing supply over time. So this is one that certainly, compared to, say, scenario A, does have some forecast benefits from Gary and his team's work around housing supply over time. So that's why we've recommended a slightly refined version of scenario B. If we just click through, I think at this point we've got Phil can just show you how the GIS viewer will look for local board and iwi engagement, and also for the public when you make a decision about where to head with this plan change.
Right, kia ora koutou. So if decisions are made today to progress with scenario B, to engage with local boards and to consult with iwi, we've built a GIS viewer to support that. So I'll just give you a little bit of a demonstration today. This will be used by our planners through Hui and also going out to local board meetings over the next couple of weeks or so. So to just zoom into a particular location, coming into the Takapuna area, what we're looking at on screen at the moment is just the operative plan as it stands at the moment. But if we start to layer up in the same way that was talked through by John, and we start to actually build through, we start with our walkable catchments, providing for our walkable catchment around Takapuna, Smales Farm, and also bringing through the policy 3D areas that apply around Milford and Northcote. For this scenario, it doesn't apply through for other areas. Then we're dropping down into the frequent transit network corridor, and given we're within that 10 kilometre distance of the city centre, we're starting to show the spatial extent of our 200 metres out from those corridors. The next part of the build would be the height variation control, and this is important because if you take it back to seeing some of those build images where we had for Takapuna, the green area, it's important to convey that that doesn't mean that it's a 15-storey height right across the entirety of that walkable catchment. We've got a number of different residential zones in there, we've got open space zoning, and we've got our height variation control, which is our little blue outlines that we've got here as well. So you can see that for each of those, we actually label it, whether it be on the seaward side of Lake Road where we've got a 13 metre height, or whether it's on the city side of Lake Road where we've got the 50 metres or the 15 stories. And lastly, the build is to actually bring through what we've actually proposed as the zoning approach, and so that actually fills out all of those spaces. The last part of the equation is when we go in and look at the natural hazard type implications. So we've got our 5% annual exceedance and our 1% annual exceedance. So remember, our policy approach for natural hazards is that if we're within the 1 in 20 year flood areas, then we're looking to down zone to single house zone. And if it's just within the 1 in 100 or the 1% areas, then we're looking to hold at what the operative zoning is. And so you can see in the areas around places like Nile Road, where the actual mapping comes through there. So this view will be used to enable 4 local boards and iwi to be able to call on the staff to zoom into particular locations, layer it up in the way in which they prefer in order to support their feedback.
And without the context, under plan change 120 that's currently notified, that did have some downzoning and some controls, but actually this is a further step, what actually further shows it needs to be data-based, and I know myself and Councillor Ferry have been pushing hard for more work on this, but I think this is starting to show that the downzoning shows up on top of the, however many 100 pages of policy show the restrictions in building and hazard zones.
Yes, and when we get to that slide on the main slide pack for natural hazards, I'll talk to some of the site and capacity implications of that downzoning. That's it for the viewer.
All right. So Sandra, if you wouldn't mind just flicking back to the PowerPoint. Next slide, please. And that's one view of scenario A and B next to each other, but the better one is actually if you can click one more time. Sandra, sorry, click to the next slide. So scenario A, essentials only, so that's the extent of change. So the white area on this one is about 87% of the urban area. So 13% of the urban area of Auckland would have changed proposals, mostly directed by the National Policy Statement of Urban Development, some changes because of hazards, and that gets you to about 13% of the region changing. If you can go to scenario B, which just builds on that a bit, if you do a click there. So scenario B has brought in those bus corridors down Sandringham Road, Dominion Road, etc., in the isthmus mainly, and a few on the North Shore that Phil mentioned. It brings in 23 local centres as well as all of the larger town centres with 6-storey development allowed around those local centres. As I mentioned, it brings in 20 frequent transport corridors inside the 10Ks, and it does have the additional height on those walkable catchments around the train stations on the southern and central lines, eastern central lines. That's the difference there. But as with the previous one, the white area is an area of no proposed changes. So unlike Plan Change 120, which was proposing changes right across the entire urban area, all of that white was in the mix in some way, shape or form for some sort of zoning changes. This one here concentrates it, just like scenario A, to about 15% of the region. So the last one was about 13%. This has got a little bit more change, mainly because of those bus routes and the centres. So it's about a 15% of the land area, of the urban area, changing, as opposed to the other one had about 13%. So not a massive difference regionally, but some significant changes with the bus routes and the local centres. So that's just to try and explain the difference between A and B. They're the closest of the two. Once you move to C, it's a very different situation with a lot of that white area going through some form of zoning change, as with scenario D, which has a lot of change in the white area. And I think we're just about there. Oh, sorry, we've just got a little bit on hazards here for Phil.
Right, so firstly I've got Mark Tamura behind me. Mark is our lead expert at the moment on Plan Change 120 going forward on the natural hazard side of things for both the coastal hazards and flooding. So if we do get into technical questions, I'll bring Mark forward.
Sorry.
If we get into technical questions, I'll bring Mark forward. Okay, so we've followed through, we've implemented the policy approach that we've workshopped with you. We have now mapped the 5% and 1% floodplain areas, and it's the areas of high and very high risk that we actually show with respect to those two sets of floodplains. So those are what we see as driving the zoning outcomes, being what I just spoke to. So if it's an area of land, which being a site which is unable to take an additional building platform and is subject to the 5% AEP or the 1 in 20 year high or very high flooding risk, then it will get downzoned to single house zone or held at the single house zone if it has already got that zoning. And then the same equivalent for the 1% return period with building platforms, and if it is unable to actually sustain an additional building platform, then it will hold what the operative zoning is for that property. So what that equates to, given that flooding is the shift that we're taking, we're not taking a further shift from our landslide policy approach or our coastal hazard management approach. So from a flooding point of view, we're now looking to move from what was 1,875 properties, which were zoned to reflect flooding risk, to now have 7,753 properties. Now, that equates through to a plan-enabled capacity reduction from what we proposed within Plan Change 120 of 19,787. So broadly within the numbers that I spoke to you about back on the 10th of March. Against that overall plan-enabled capacity, we're looking at around about a 20,000 number, which is the result of our policy approach that we're taking for flooding. Beyond that, there's probably not too much to say. All of the rainfall data has been included, both for the rural areas and for the urban areas. I also understand that there have been some queries that have been coming through from some constituents with respect to climate scenarios. So I've been reaching out through to our Chief Sustainability Office with respect to this. So there was a guidance document 15 that was released and published to Knowledge Auckland last week. It's important that you are briefed on what that means and how that cascades through from our overall climate plan, through those guidance document materials, down into our LIM processes, down into our flood viewers, and down into the unitary plan and consenting as well. So I'll be working with Katarina Maki in the Chief Sustainability Office to try and work to find a time in order to give you a briefing, given the fact that that material has just been released by Council.
Okay, Sandra. Process ahead. So here we are, 9th of June. Hopefully a decision on a scenario or scenarios for engagement. Then we'll have that engagement with iwi and local boards. We'll bring that back to you end of July for a decision on whether to amend PC 120 or not. You have the option of sticking with it as it is. But even if you choose not to amend it, there will still be an opportunity for submitters to add to their existing submission, join if they're not a submitter already. They could withdraw their submission. So it really opens up a brand new round of submissions once you make that decision, which you're required to do under the changes to the RMA. So then we have the submissions and submitters able to present before the independent hearings panel, who are, I think as you all know, have been appointed for quite some time now by Council and the Government to hear these submissions. We've got the 10,500 submissions already. They still stand. They can continue on, even if new submissions are made. Then we'll expect to receive the recommendations from the panel next year in time for your decision making by June, which is the statutory requirement under the Minister's direction to make decisions by June next year. So that's the process. I think that's the last slide. So we are keen to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the 5 years of work and still a lot more to go. So thank you for responding to the constant change. You guys in your team have been doing your best to deal with all our questions and the constant changing nature and very complex nature of this. So I've got some questions so far. I'm sure there'll be more. Councillor Ferry, Deputy Chair. Kia ora.
Kia ora, and sorry, I'm not able to be there in person today. Sandra, I don't know if you've had, I just sent you through an email with an image. It's going to be really blurry for folks, but if you could get that up, that would be really helpful, because I want to clarify something here. We're looking at, and apologies to staff, I've unfortunately been unwell since Friday morning, so I haven't been able to raise this with you before now, but I wanted to get a steer on, obviously one of my big motivations through this discussion has been the flood prone stuff, and I really appreciate the work that staff have done in response to my advocacy to go in and look again at what was proposed in the notified plan, and come up with a new methodology and a new way of classifying it. Just looking at the scenarios at those high level maps, this is the area around what I've referred to as the Gribblehurst Depression. These are you'll see that green space on the left, folks. That's Gribblehurst Park. And the area on the right, the main road, you can see there is Sandringham Road, and the area on the right flooded very badly in 2023. So I'm using this as an example, but I've noticed it with a couple of other flood-prone areas in my ward as well from looking at these maps. So what I wanted to ask about is noting that D on the right, with all that dark orange around that area, is Plan Change 120 is notified, and you've got the unitary plan as it stands on the left. It looks to me like in Plan Change in scenario C, which is the one that I was more inclined to support because of its comprehensive nature, but in scenario C, we've got some additional downzoning there to mixed housing suburban, the yellow one, compared to the unitary plan. And I've noticed this in a couple of other of my flood impacted areas too. Can you explain that a little bit more? Because conversations I've had to date have been that the new approach has been applied consistently across the 4 scenarios, and I can see that because that's the white bits, right? But in C, there appears to be additional downzoning, and I'd be really keen to support that, because this is been from the start one of my big motivators with this is how do we make sure we are intensifying around the city centre, but downzoning where there is flood risk. So I suspect Phil and maybe Mark might be the right people to speak to this one.
Yeah, through the chair, it isn't flooding that we're actually looking at as the cause of C and that downzoning.
Right.
It's that framework of urban accessibility, or the FUA.
Right,
And
so it's
how
the
that
proximity,
applies from an accessibility point of view. So those MHS sites don't benefit from that degree of accessibility that the MHU ones around them do.
Okay, cool. That's really helpful for me. And I think it might be worth colleagues having a little think about, having a little bit more of a look, because because of those proximity issues, may actually play out differently from what you might have thought, as I've just discovered looking at this one. Thank you, Chair. I may have some more questions, but that was my burning one that I was ready to ask. So I'll let you go to others now, but I might need to put my hand up again if I'm well enough. Thanks.
Thanks.
And you can take the slide down. Thanks, Sandra.
Thanks so much for that, and thanks for the staff for getting that quickly on screen. Councillor Sayers.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. One, with the GIS system, with the scenarios that the local boards can use in iwi, I take it that the public can't access those?
Yeah, that's right. It takes about a 2-week period to take an internal-facing GIS viewer and turn it into an external-facing GIS viewer. So, yeah, staff have specific logons that they can use, and they'll take those along to each of the local board meetings and hui to display. Yep.
Thank you. So at the moment, if I'm getting a few queries from people saying, "Oh, how's my property being affected?" I just say, look, the source of truth is to go to our live GIS system. That's the current zonings.
Well, there's also the PDFs that are attached to the agenda item as well, so you can zoom in quite effectively on those ones as well.
Okay. In terms of floodplains, the formula, can I just confirm, the formula that's been used to produce the modelling, is that primarily, or is that driven by central government's data or modelling or formulas?
And this is what I sort of alluded to by getting a briefing for you. It is actually quite a complex story to tell, as it cascades down from the central government guidance documents through earth science, down into our climate plan, through into our guidance documents, and down into the flood modelling. So I think it's quite important that some of the changes of metrics that have been occurring around RCPs through to SSPs is talked through. From our point of view in the unitary plan, we'll always have what we call static definitions that are used so that you can get a site-specific assessment done by a hydrological engineer to actually prove whether you are or are not actually within an area of high risk or very high risk. We use the mapping as an indication, and we note that it's for information purposes and it's dynamic. So it's a duty of care or best endeavours to assist people in understanding, but we also note that that is always continuing to improve through time. And that's what's just happened recently with the ability to incorporate all of the new rainfall data.
Thank you for that. That's helpful. If I might just ask a supplementary, I don't know if you can answer this question, but if they go through that, if a landowner or set of landowners affected by potentially affected by the maps go through the exercise of commissioning somebody to come and do a hydrological report on it, and they submit it, I guess, to council's planning or healthy waters. I'm not quite sure how that would work, but if there's a disagreement, so they do that work and they submit it to the Auckland Council through the right processes, and the Auckland Council says, well, we reject that report. If that scenario occurred, what options are there to try and find resolution or some sort of mediation point?
Yeah, I think it's important to talk about the use of that type of report. In most instances, people are using that because they've got a building consent or a resource consent or a subdivision that they're in the midst of doing. And so that report is primarily for that, to prove or disprove whether they are or are not within a floodplain area. But your question, I think, is more about how can that type of report actually influence these regional data sets? And the answer to that lies in how we actually maintain those regional data sets. The exercise is a large one to go through to actually review all of those. The work that was done by Healthy Waters to support us in being able to actually bring this information in as part of PC 120 was an intensive piece of work by the GIS teams, both within our own planning and resource consents area and Healthy Waters, and was over about a 6-week period in order to actually do that. So I think it's best if we get our Head of Intelligence, Nick Brown, to actually talk to what is that regime of management of that regional data set of flood modelling, and how do these individual pieces of information actually flow through and get used.
Okay, and just fine. If maybe I should have put it in a bit more context, and the deputy mayor might be interested. It probably boils down, like there's an area in Rodney, it's up north, called Omaha. They're saying that the flood maps are wrong. They've gone and done the reports, and I think they're running into resistance from the council picking those up. So that was the context, right? And I should probably outline that for you. So do we still go through, Nick? You know what? How do we get?
Yeah, I mean that would be a good case study to use.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Turner.
Thank you. The hazard maps, when we started this, we were talking about the fact that once they were published, they became active and people had to abide by them. That was correct, wasn't it, once they were published?
So, yeah, when you use the word abide, I think it's important to understand that they are a regional data set and they're indicative. And so we use them in a way to identify the likelihood of the actual floodplain being in that location. But as I said, it's up to a site-specific assessment to prove or disprove that it is or is not actually within that area of risk.
Thanks. But we also have a lot of talk about the engineering, the way we could construct our way away from problems, etc. When do we look at those maps? I'm also aware that that the regulatory department tells me that the GIS maps are the very important thing they use to work on some of the conundrums they come up against with zoning, with non-compliance complaints, with rebuilding and how that affects the consents. So I'm just worried about a closed loop sort of thing where if those plans are so important and yet there's potentially a lot of change in how we approach them, in how they are developed. Where's the reset each time to look at those plans? Because that would have an effect on the numbers significantly.
And that's where it's important to actually have the resourcing that actually sits behind those to actually maintain them. Across the country, I think we're best placed of all flood modelling that is undertaken. We've got some reference points for how we use it. So through the Local Government Act, there is the responsibilities for LIMS, which is based on the I'll get this right, the potential of that being there, rather than the likelihood of it being there. When it comes to the RMA system, we've got the NPS of natural hazards, which is asking us also to actually look with an eye to what are the potential risks that are there. So it's important that we are precautionary in the way in which we work, and that was one of the principles that we took as part of building the natural hazards policy approach for this plan change. But I take the point that as ground levels change, as infrastructure changes, as impermeable surfaces change through time, the number of inputs that are going into our flood modelling is requiring almost supercomputer processes to be undertaken. All of that rainfall data which came in, yes, it was a 6-week period to be able to actually spit out the results for us to give us this additional opportunity with the 1 in 20-year flood modelling. But I would suggest that with all of these, it's important that there is support in the background for how it's maintained. And that's why I think it's important that you get a briefing, not just in the actual climate science and how those scenarios are used, but that how the mechanics behind it all, for how we present this to the public, is supported.
It is hard for the public to perceive that when it's a academic consideration balancing compared to their real day impacts. The last thing, I've lost it, there's so many here, I've went to another one and haven't come back. The summary of the submissions, there's one picture there which is a big block which is numbered up. Miscellaneous is the biggest by far. Now I see that miscellaneous said that it's things outside the submission process like car parks, etc. But that in the public's eye feeds hugely into what we're deciding here today, and yet is this miscellaneous, I can't remember the number now, 13,000 was it, or something like that, which is the biggest block. Is that kind of been left out of the considerations?
Well, it's not a choice that we face. So under the NPS urban development, the management of on-site car parking is not something that we're allowed to manage. And so we went through the process of removing all of those provisions from the unitary plan. And even though there might be disquiet and submissions that are received that seek to manage it, it's not something that we're allowed to manage.
Should be. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Patterson-Hamlin.
Kia ora. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting there. My understanding is, as we move from, so I'm going to leave out D for now because it's a little different, a little out of step, I guess, with the others. But as we move from C to B to A, the intensification burden becomes stronger on the southern and western fringes of the city in favour of downzoning in the centre. Is that a fair statement?
As you move from C to B to A, the burden stronger in the southern areas of the city. I think if we can bring up the map then.
Yeah, if we bring up the map. So,
Donna, if you could just
I'm going to
bring
phrase it a different way.
Could you bring the mic a little closer,
Yeah.
just this side?
Sorry.
So,
So best map would be the one with the 4 scenarios, if you wouldn't mind. Oh, sorry, we need to
Use this or not?
No, I don't think it's the best idea because we're comparing different scenarios. So we need to go to the slide before that, please, Sandra, with The clicker just does not work.
Councillor Short is going to support me, and perhaps Councillor Gillen as well. QBC, please.
Yep. So it's got A, B, C, and D. Yep.
So I'm holding B, Councillor Short is holding A, and Councillor Gillen is holding C. Now, I know he doesn't want to, but you can swap if you really want. My understanding is there's a lot more of the peach sort of outside the circle is as we move from scenario C through to A. So the west and the south, sort of down towards this way, and when I say west, it's sort of a couple of bits of faux, but it's mostly Waitakere Ward, are taking on more of the intensification burden. They're taking on more of that infill housing so that the bits in the middle that are nearer the amenities do not have to have as much upzoning. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't believe that's a fair assessment at all. I think A and B, so as you move from B to A, there is more intensification enabled in B and the isthmus than in A. So you're actually having potentially more development in the isthmus under B than in A.
I think we're talking at slightly cross purposes here, because I think you're maybe talking about absolute numbers, and I think what I'm talking about is maybe spread of the peach and the orange. You mean from the Yes, from the yes.
So Sarah has asked me this, Councillor Patterson-Hamlin has asked me this offline, because obviously she wasn't here during unitary plan debates, but I think what you're trying to understand is why the zoning is far more intensive already out west than it is in the central suburbs.
Right.
And how A and B, especially A, don't fix that disparity. Is that what I was trying to explain? That decisions were made in 2016, kind of hard to decipher now.
Yeah, I think that's a good interpretation of a lot of my question. Yeah.
So if the council was to stay with D, that scenario, Plan Change 120 is notified, does enable a lot more medium density, 3-storey residential in particular, across the region and in areas that under the current unitary plan don't allow that. So yes, you would start to see a lot more opportunities in central than you do currently in the unitary plan. So D, sticking with D, certainly does that. C, I don't believe really adjusts that to a great degree. And B and A, I think as the chair's mentioning, yes, they don't address, I think we're saying is a difference in that areas like Te Atatū, for example, in the west, and some areas in the south do allow for more development than in the central parts of Auckland. So if you were in favour, maybe to put another way, of addressing that, you would be looking in a very fundamental way, you'd be looking at some scenario, perhaps a D or something between a C and a D, because A and B, neither of those fundamentally address widespread rezoning in the wider residential area. If you think about the maps that I showed with the white out, they apply to A and B. So A and B for wide parts of suburban Auckland, regardless of whether it's north, central, south or west, no real changes proposed. It's only when you look at scenarios C, big changes in the wider residential right across the region, and D, fundamental changes right across the region, that you start to correct some of those anomalies where there is some more development. For historic reasons, as part of the development of the unitary plan, that's the way it landed in the west and the south. There were more opportunities for intensification than in some parts of central Auckland. Some of that relates to the older character bungalow and villa suburbs as well in the central parts of Auckland that have protections in place. But if you really supported a scenario or wanted to fundamentally change that, you'd be looking at a C or a D, not an A or a B, because A and B have that no change to the wider suburban areas. It's very focused around the train stations and the centres. And of the two, really C isn't, I don't believe, fundamentally putting more of the pink 3-storey medium density in the areas that you're referring to. You would have to sort of be looking at sticking with something like a scenario D, PC 120 as it is, as opposed to any of the other scenarios.
Thank you. I think that is what I'm getting at, and it's why I didn't hold up this one, now I've got another visual, with it all whited out with a unitary plan, because I think the context of the AUP is important, because it demonstrates, to my understanding, and I think that makes sense. Sorry, John. Yeah, I think it demonstrates that existing inequity, and if one of the ideas behind PC 120 is to address those inequalities, then that's something that we need to factor into our thinking. And also, I suppose, a lot of people had the experience of with the floods and being hammered and you know, loss of permeable space disproportionately in some areas as opposed to others, was all a part of that. So I think that all comes into it. I appreciate that was not a straightforward question, but thank you for attempting to answer it. And thank you to my colleagues, Councillors Gillen and Short, for their support. I didn't give them a heads up that I was going to ask them to do that. So, okay, final partai from me for now. So A wouldn't enable buildings like Aroha and Avondale or the yellow one in Newland, the yellow rim window one in Newland that keeps coming up on these slides. They wouldn't be enabled under scenario A, would they? Because they're too tall, even though they're right next to train stations and have, in my view, brought a lot to those city centres.
Yeah, through the chair, I believe both of those are maybe between 6 and 10 stories. Newland's probably up, yeah.
14 and
14 and
9, yeah.
Yeah, so that scale there, which is less common, but there are a few examples of, 10-storey plus apartment buildings would only be allowed around the 5 stations on the Western Line under A. Government mandated the 5 stations, so that's the Mongawhau, Morningside, Kingsland, Baldwin Avenue, Mount Albert would allow developments of that scale, but around all of the other train stations, 6 stories would be the maximum under A, whereas B would start to allow some of the 10 and the 15 stories around some of the other train stations, but again, just in the isthmus, not in the outlying areas. I will point out, though, and I think it's really important to note, that we're predominantly talking about residential zoned land, residential streets. In all 11 of the metropolitan centres, which is, for example, the commercial part of Newland and Henderson, buildings of 15 to 18 stories have been allowed since 2016 and before. So in your commercial areas, where you've got the shops and some industrial premises, that's where the opportunities would exist for the Newland type example, which is on business commercial land. It's not on residential land. So maybe it's a qualified answer. In residential areas, scenario A would only allow buildings above 6 stories on the 5 train stations, around the 5 train stations. But in the commercial areas, there are still plenty of opportunities for buildings above 10 stories in the 11 metro centres, and even in some of the town centres, getting up to 10 stories. Yep. But B certainly does more heavy lifting in terms of height than A, and in fact, B, C and D are all sort of allowing for more heights around the train stations. C and D allow it around many of the train stations, not just the inner 10 kilometres. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So I do have one more that I remembered, if that's okay. Affordability. Could you talk us through the differences to housing affordability across the 4 scenarios?
We don't have our Chief Economist, Gary Blick, here, but he has presented in a couple of workshops. He's here, so I think it's best that an economist who's been doing some modelling around this speaks to the affordability implications. So Gary, come and join us.
Just want to bring that mic nice and close, just for those online. Thanks, Gary.
Through the chair, good afternoon, kia ora koutou. Thank you, Councillor Patterson-Hamlin. In response to your question about affordability, to support John and the team, we've been looking at a 10-year forecast of housing supply, so that is looking at how the market may respond to the enablement under the different capacity scenarios that John's talked through. That forecast is based on observed relationships we've seen over the period of the unitary plan between the level of enablement that we've got, as well as locations, their relative attractiveness and the degree of development intensity. And then we can vary the policy settings to see how supply might respond. So across the scenarios, we've got a sense of the general direction. We don't want to be putting so much weight on the precise numbers, but you can get a sense of scale across the scenarios. And then from the additional housing that we can see across the scenarios, we can draw on estimates in the literature about how house prices respond to a material increase in housing supply. So what I would say about it is that if your question is regarding affordability, we think under all scenarios we would have more housing than otherwise would be the case, progressively up through the scenarios, and that would be supportive of house prices in the future being better than otherwise. By better, I mean lower than otherwise. And that's not to say that we would expect house prices to fall, but that the rate of increase may be lower than otherwise. So in summary, in response to your question, by enabling more capacity, and it does depend on how much and where that capacity is enabled, we think it'd be beneficial for housing supply and for affordability.
So what's the difference between each of the scenarios for affordability? I get that they'll all have a positive impact, but they're not all identical because otherwise we wouldn't be debating.
Well, we have offered a range in each case to recognise that there's some uncertainty, and the idea of that range is to reflect that the way in which existing residents would respond to the additional supply and the way in which migration flows would respond to the additional supply are reasons why we have a range. And the ranges aren't meant to be precise predictions, but it's saying all else equal, and we're looking 10 years ahead, these are 10-year forecasts, would we expect them all to be different? And we do, and the ranges that we've reported for scenario A, we think 1 to 2%, ranging up to scenario B, around sort of 3 to 5%, fairly similar for C, around 4 to 6, and then a bit more for scenario D at 5 to 8. So, from one to another, you can see that there's a little bit of differentiation there. So it's about relativities rather than precision at this point. Thank you.
And as with the enabling numbers, there's overlap across. Yeah, cool. Thank you very much, and thank you for your indulgence, Chair. I'm calling it for now.
Thank you, Councillor. Would you like to second my motion to extend the time?
Yes, please.
All those in favour? And all those in favour? There was no noise, so I assume that means the debate's over and we can go home. But all those in favour? Any opposed? Okay. So it's up to all of us how quickly this goes. So we've got 5 questioners left. Councillor Bartley.
Oh, thank you. I'm just thinking, some of us who represent areas that are within the Central Isthmus are already undergoing significant intensification. Which option would spread that load? So that's, we just happen to be within 10 kilometres, but we're already intensified.
So through the chair, scenario A would bring about the least change in Maungakiki Tamaki ward area, so that would have the least change. B, a little bit more, but C would start to allow more development potentially, and certainly D allows more development. But there is no scenario that sort of moves the opportunity away from isthmus into other areas. None of these scenarios are sort of, if you like, taking away opportunities from the isthmus and moving them elsewhere. If anything, scenario B is sort of bringing a bit more intensification into the isthmus. So there isn't one that's really doing that, to be honest. There's no redistribution away from the isthmus under any of the scenarios, really.
Okay. And then earlier you said that people still have a chance to be submitters. So some people want to, already our inboxes are getting emails. Will people have a chance to submit on these options?
They wouldn't have a chance to submit on these scenarios because this is really you as a governing body with input from iwi and local boards working through to what ultimately a preferred scenario is, at which point it would go out to the public to make submissions and then appear before the panel, and then you're not making your final decisions until next year. But on this sort of developing approach of taking scenarios and then getting to the point where you've got a single scenario, there's no proposal at this point to be engaging more widely with the public. Their opportunity would be when you've made a decision in July to then make submissions. Sorry, Phil's got something to add here.
Yeah, just to make a note there that when, if a decision is made to progress with an alternative proposal, the plan change as notified being scenario D still remains as the actual plan change. And so when that further opportunity is made available for submissions to come in, people can choose to actually put another submission in against the plan change as notified, which is scenario D. And they can also put submissions in on what the amended proposal is, whether that is A or B or C.
Right, but that's only people that have already submitted.
No, members of the public who have not been involved in the process can start to become involved in the process for the first time.
Okay, cool, thanks. And my last question, please, was we are, looking at train stations where we have invested, but there are train stations along some of these lines where we're proposing to intensify that have pretty much, it's just a train stop, nothing really there. There's nothing much in that train station, not really a train station. So will there be some work done about looking at budgets to upgrade those train stations? Will there be some exceptions to those train stations that perhaps they cannot be intensified along those lines around there?
Through the chair, I wouldn't imagine the state of an existing train station would be a reason not to allow for the intensification, and the government's requirement is the 6 stories. So I'm not familiar with Auckland Transport's plans for looking at the stations over time. I suspect that over time the sort of stations you're referring to would need to be upgraded, but that's something that we'd really need Auckland Transport to come back and give us a bit more information about their plans for upgrading stations over time. I'm not sure if Megan, if you have anything to add, but we can try and get a bit more information from AT around station upgrades.
Thank you. Member Wilson.
Thank you. I'm going to stick to the topic of the consultation you're going to have with mana whenua iwi authorities and local, specifically iwi authorities. So my first part, it acknowledges in the report it's been difficult to determine clearly which scenario would be supported by mana whenua, but we have here, other than the proposed amendment, we have here scenario B. Can you just outline how it came to be that you would, for consultation with iwi authorities and local boards, you would put up scenario B as a preferred choice?
Through the chair, I guess the idea of having a preferred scenario is really to try and make it a bit easier to get some feedback on just one single approach. As I mentioned before, we always anticipated sharing with iwi mana whenua and local boards how the committee has sort of reached a preferred scenario, and that would be to explain briefly the other scenarios. So, yeah, I guess there's no really compelling reason why you couldn't engage on all 4, but we felt that maybe it's just going to be simpler to engage primarily on one, get the feedback on one. But as I say, we do intend to explain all 4 scenarios and how we've arrived at a preferred scenario, or scenarios, depending on what you decide this afternoon.
Thank you. Then it talks about attachment K, references the iwi support for intensification near centres and transport networks. But the support has consistently been caveated with heritage protection conditions. So my pātai, to what extent has scenario B given operative effect to these conditions?
So all scenarios continue to keep those protections that are in the unitary plan in place for things like sites and places of significance to mana whenua, the view shafts to the maunga, areas of protected indigenous vegetation, those sorts of protections in the unitary plan. All scenarios look to keep those in place. Because of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, where those protections are limiting heights within the walkable catchments and so on, we've had to re-justify them. And so through the Plan Change 120 supporting material that went up for submissions last year, all of the justification for retaining those protections is already in there, and there's no proposal at this stage to change any of that.
So the report is quite open and candid about PC 120 may only apply for 15 months before the RMA is replaced. So I guess the pātai is, what's the strategic value of the current consultation process that's being mooted here today?
Yeah, this is something we have touched on in workshops, and we'd like to explore that a bit more with the committee during this engagement phase. The government's reforms, new legislation comes into place August, September this year, is what as we understand it. Under the bills that we saw earlier this year, and the council made submissions on the two bills, the planning bill and the natural environment bill, there is a requirement to do a new regional spatial plan and then what's called a combined plan to replace the unitary plan in roughly 2 or 3 years' time. And that's a whole new planning framework, a whole new legal system. And so there's all this effort going into what we're doing right now as Auckland Council and Aucklanders. And so yeah, there is a big challenge with where does this all lead to if the council is having to do something similar again in a few years' time. So we'd like to explore that with you in a workshop because yeah, there is no simple answer to, there's certainly not an answer that once this process is finished, that's it for the next 5-10 years. It's certainly got more complexity than that, and we don't have an answer, but we can certainly give you some thoughts on that.
That is an answer. I'll only be another couple of questions through the chair. So which scenario, well, comparison means that you're comparing it with another scenario, which I guess having one there is not the nature of a comparison if you're taking that to consultation. So that's my first point. But if that was the case, comparatively speaking, which of those or the combo of those gives you a better sense in consultation with mana whenua around matters that are significant, i.e. qualifying matters? And you touched on that, the maunga view shafts, to treaty redress and what the impacts will be, the matters that you understand and know that mana whenua are very passionate about. So of those, what would be the best scenario in terms of comparison and consultation on the comparison?
Well, just based on previous engagement, and certainly wouldn't want to preempt what we're going to hear through engagement over the next month or so, there were some concerns with Plan Change 120 because it still had the 3-storey medium density right across all of the suburbs. There are some places of significance to mana whenua, either through views or the whenua on that very spot, that may not have protection in the unitary plan, but with that widespread rezoning across all of the suburbs, there were some concerns in the feedback from mana whenua. We did look through the engagement on PC 120 and PC 78 before it to try and mitigate some of those risks, but I think that's the one that has the biggest risk in terms of engagement previously. The more you concentrate the intensification in and around the walkable catchments and so on and the centres, the less widespread, the less risk of that occurring.